As Roger has pointed out, one of the motivations for these lectures on demythologizing religion is to emphasize how we must learn to live together in healthy, compassionate, wise, and joyful ways. As he put it, you can be very accepting of what other people's religious beliefs are, as long as there's not a casualty count. In particular, I've been interested in how many use or misuse a faith tradition in order to protect abusive and oppressive systems of thinking and acting. As I've noted before, an institution that can't survive without tolerating or protecting abuse should not survive.
Amen.
Buddhism has long enjoyed a reputation, at least in the West, for being one of the more flexible and tolerant religions. There are good reasons for that, and my focus today is going to be on one of those strengths. But it's also important to point out that Buddhism has been subject to the same limitations as any other cultural or religious system, including fundamentalist violence. Buddhist societies have struggled with war. They've struggled with economic injustice, with patriarchal and gender violence, with racism, even with genocide. For those wanting to go more deeply into this topic, Michael Jerrison, who wrote If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Buddhism, Politics, and Violence, has made important and crucial contributions to the study of violence in Buddhism. It was Jerrison's work, for example, that introduced me to one historical extreme, a story from 6th century China when, quote, the Buddhist monk Fa Qing led a revolt and declared the arrival of a new Buddha. He marshaled 50,000 men to fight, promising them that with each kill, they would reach a higher stage in the Bodhisattva path. We want to be honest about this history and also about the current violence that's filled the news over the last several years from places that are traditionally Buddhist. From Sri Lanka to Myanmar to Thailand and beyond, we've witnessed that Buddhists are not immune to the rise of nationalism or the horrors of committing religious and ethnic violence. As Phil Robertson, the Deputy Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, has reminded us, quote, the problem is far too many Westerners fail to understand that Buddhism, like any other religion, can be misused for political purposes. And that's an important reminder. One of the challenges all cultural traditions have to navigate is not only to create healthy patterns of relating to ourselves, others, and the earth in the first place, but also updating those healthy patterns and sustaining them. Even with our best intentions, it's not automatic and it's not inevitable. Today, I'd like to focus on one of those ways that religious discourse and thinking is so often misused, using my own experience growing up in a conservative Christian tradition as a point of contrast. Like many of you, I grew up in a tradition that viewed mental assent to a set of doctrines, very strict and defined set of doctrines, as the pinnacle of faith. We were taught that, 1, we already knew what to believe. 2, our beliefs represented changeless and eternal truths. And 3, our obligation as people of faith was to accept those beliefs as 100% true, and then to do everything we could to live up to them and defend them. Though I'm certain my childhood teachers would disagree with this, it resulted in a situation where coercion was really the heart of my religious experience. Everything was already decided, and our only responsibility was to believe what we were told. Any attempt to change those beliefs were experienced as threats. Our faith was under attack, and let me tell you, our faith was always under attack. Keeping the faith meant doing our best to believe certain doctrines, no matter what evidence might exist to influence those beliefs. And we were encouraged to base our entire identity on our commitment to believing and defending core doctrines, the popularly called fundamentals. We were taught that if we allowed any of those fundamentals to be understood in a different way, let alone doubted, our entire faith system was going to crumble to the dust. There's a lot of pressure involved, as you might guess, and as you probably know. This is pointed out as an observation. Although some religious systems seem to be particularly vulnerable, all human beings have this capacity, whatever their culture, whatever their religion. We can become so attached to our views that we willingly harm ourselves or others to defend them. This may be to protect our privileges, our power and conveniences. It may be to protect our own identity, our self-view, to avoid facing our complicity and injustice. It may be to avoid social rejection, preventing our relationships or employment or social supports from being snatched away. And my observation is, especially recently, this has been increasingly what's going on. People holding on to their group identity for dear life. It may be to insulate us from information that would be overwhelming or that would leave us feeling helpless or afraid. This capacity for self-deception and for clinging so desperately to a self-view is a survival mechanism because, as we've discussed before, natural selection is more interested in whether you survive than whether you're right. When a society or a community is healthy, many of these assumptions work well, or they work well enough. But human society has been sick. That's pretty obvious. And we're stuck in unhealthy patterns on a repeat. Gratefully, we are increasingly understanding why this is so, how this happens, how these processes work in both our minds and in our communities. There's an urgency to this healing work, however. The frighteningly rapid expansion of conspiracy theories has exposed, for example, the lie that we're somehow immune to being manipulated. All of this can be painful and difficult to tackle and digest. And that's why it's just always so important that we cultivate gratitude for critical thinking, for scientific disciplines, for reflective practices that can help correct the mistaken assumptions and behaviors that otherwise bring about terrible oppression and disparities and injustice. All cultural and religious traditions need to continually be a part of that transformation, including Buddhism. I began studying Buddhism academically in the late 1990s, but I didn't begin really practicing with the Buddhist teachings until 2005. What I found immediately empowering was that, in contrast to my childhood religious experience, the Buddhism that I encountered didn't emphasize mental assent at all. While the goal of Buddhist practice, which is enlightenment or awakening, does connect with what's called right view as part of the Eightfold Path, right view isn't a mere list of doctrines. Instead, right view is something that grows out of your practice, something that emerges out of the cultivation of insight and wisdom. Mere belief in a set of doctrines is never promised to lead you out of suffering. And you cannot coerce yourself into believing something that will suddenly make everything magically okay. Instead, through developing insight into how suffering actually arises, when it arises, what fuels the process of suffering, and what helps suffering to abate, to go away, that's when our understanding is deepened and wisdom has a chance to grow. As we develop wisdom and compassion, we're able to relate more skillfully to every aspect of our lives, including that suffering that we experience. It doesn't happen by forcing ourselves to believe a certain way. It happens because we allow our beliefs, our views, to be shaped by putting the teachings into practice, then, not stopping there, observing the impact of what we do and paying attention in a way that we gain insight into what's happening in our lives. That's called the practice of right view. As an example of how Buddhists have tried to embody this approach in today's complicated world, I think it's helpful to turn to the 14 Mindfulness Trainings that were developed by the Most Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh in Saigon in 1966. Think of that year, in Saigon in 1966. That context is important, as it was part of the ongoing efforts of socially engaged Buddhists in Vietnam to try to find a way to work for justice and peace amid the build-up to and then the horrors of war. And those 14 mindfulness trainings have remained a core part of both the Plum Village tradition and the Order of Interbeing ever since then. The first 3 of these trainings are especially relevant to this reflection on right view. The first one is on openness. Aware of the suffering created by fanaticism and intolerance, we are determined not to be idolatrous about or bound to any doctrine, theory, or ideology, even Buddhist ones. We are committed to seeing the Buddhist teachings as a guiding means that help us learn to look deeply and develop understanding and compassion. They are not doctrines to fight, kill, or die for. We understand that fanaticism in its many forms is a result of perceiving things in a dualistic or discriminative manner. We will train ourselves to look at everything with openness and the insight of inner being in order to transform dogmatism and violence in ourselves and in the world. A lot stands out in this training, but especially notice that the commitment is grounded in 2 things, in observation and in social engagement. Observation, that awareness of the suffering created by fanaticism and intolerance. It's paying attention to the impact of how we relate to our religious views. And that social engagement, it's not satisfied to just let things be as they are, but it's looking for ways that we can change how we relate to religion, to our society, to each other, in ways that develop understanding and compassion. Our starting points are a commitment to well-being and an awareness of suffering, not, as I had experienced as a child, mental assent to a doctrine or a set of doctrines, to develop understanding and compassion, not to accept the received teaching that is 100% and eternally true. This allows us to relate to our beliefs not as ends in themselves, but, as the training says, as guiding means that train us. And we aspire then, it frees us up to aspire to transform dogmatism and violence. The second mindfulness training is non-attachment to views. Here we have the teaching that says, aware of the suffering created by attachment to views and wrong perceptions, we are determined to avoid being narrow-minded and bound to present views. We are committed to learning and practicing non-attachment to views and being open to others' experiences and insights in order to benefit from the collective wisdom. We are aware that the knowledge we presently possess is not changeless, absolute truth. Insight is revealed through the practice of compassionate listening, deep looking, and letting go of notions rather than through the accumulation of intellectual knowledge. Truth is found in life, and we will observe life within and around us in every moment, ready to learn throughout our lives. Here we see cultivating an awareness that the knowledge we currently possess is not changeless, absolute truth. Now, that's an amazing aspiration to come out of a religious tradition. And it's also a classic case of easier said than done. It's unsettling to acknowledge that not only can I be wrong, but I have been wrong, and maybe even most painfully, I will be wrong again, and so will you. Our cognitive biases, we've learned, they're real, as is the human tendency to attach to our views, to say, well, this is it, and I've got it figured out, no more learning for me. Beyond this, we also understand that our knowledge of the world, from the social to the scientific, is limited. This doesn't mean that all of our understandings are up for grabs, and we should especially have confidence in the knowledge we gain that's based on the hard work of study and scientific research, our own or the peer-reviewed research of others. But even the knowledge that we have now that is correct may be, even probably will be shown to be incomplete. When you compare, for example, what we know now to what we knew 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, really even 20 years ago, it becomes quite evident that we need to cultivate a willingness to change our minds when we encounter new data. The mindfulness training points out This is a practice of being open. And I love the term open-hearted even more than open-minded. We're not believing any old thing, but we're open to change when we need to change. And it also points out that this is a practice of being open to and encouraging insight rather than merely accumulating knowledge. Insight applies that knowledge in a way that can lead to change, where we're influenced and shaped by our growing understanding of the world. The third mindfulness training is on freedom of thought. Here we're told that aware of the suffering brought about when we impose our views on others, we're determined not to force others, even our children, by any means whatsoever, such as authority, threat, money, propaganda, or indoctrination, to adopt our views. We are committed to respecting the right of others to be different, to choose what to believe and how to decide. We will, however, learn to help others let go of and transform fanaticism and narrowness through loving speech and compassionate dialogue. This training is perhaps most directly related to my experience of growing up in a tradition that focused on mental assent and believing the right things. Coercion has no place in this practice, avoiding both forcing others to adopt our own views or passively sitting back and ignoring fanaticism and narrowness. This is also why the mindfulness trainings are presented as practices, not rules that we rigidly cling to. We aspire to these ideals and then continually figure out how to live up to them in ourselves, in our communities, and in our societies. The practice itself, doing this, figuring out how to do this, and doing it again and again, that is a way of training the mind so we get better at it and our communities get better at it. Such an approach did not come from nowhere, and the Buddha Gautama's sermon to the Kalama community is probably the best known example of this. Part of his advice was that, quote, "It is proper for you, Kalamas, to doubt, to be uncertain. Uncertain has arisen in you about what is doubtful. Come, Kalamas, do not go upon what's been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon what is in the scripture, nor upon surmise, nor upon an axiom, nor upon specious reasoning, nor upon a bias towards a notion that's been pondered over, nor upon another's seeming ability, nor upon the consideration that monk is our teacher. Kalamas, when you yourselves know these things are bad, these things are blamable, these things are censured by the wise, undertaken and observed, these things, they lead to harm and ill. Abandon them. Kalamas, when you yourself know these things, these are good. These things are not blamable. These things are praised by the wise, undertaken and observed. These things lead to benefit and happiness. Enter on and abide in them." I just find that beautiful and refreshing, especially from an ancient religious teacher. It's proper for you to doubt. It's proper for you to be uncertain. The Buddha didn't appeal to his own spiritual authority, but he appealed to the ability of his listeners to think it through. A misunderstanding of this is that every view is somehow equally legitimate, or that we need to give all opinions equal consideration. Working with doubt as a spiritual practice is not the practice of paranoia or a flight into conspiracy theory. And key to this is that orientation the Buddha talked about around well-being. The Buddha instructed that we'll know if something is worth believing when we observe that it leads to health in ourselves and in society. These things lead to benefit and to happiness. Those are the things worth doing, worth our effort to abide in them. Doubt is not the goal. Well-being is the goal. And that's a standard that can help us get free of violence and oppression. It gives us something clear to aspire to, even when the road to get there is complicated. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, a Buddhist monk, scholar, and translator in the Thai forest tradition of Theravada Buddhism, has pointed out, quote, "Although this discourse is often cited as the Buddha's carte blanche for following one's own sense of right and wrong, It actually says something much more rigorous than that. Traditions are not to be followed simply because they are traditions. Reports, such as historical accounts or news, are not to be followed simply because the source seems reliable. One's own preferences are not to be followed simply because they seem logical or resonate with one's feelings. Instead, any view or belief must be tested by the results it yields when put into practice. And to guard against the possibility of bias or limitations in one's understanding of those results, they must be further checked against the experience of people who are wise. The ability to question and test one's beliefs in an appropriate way is called appropriate attention. The ability to recognize and choose wise people as mentors is called having admirable friends. And that community context that Thanissaro Bhikkhu is talking about provides the context for the story of Buddha teaching the Kalamas community. If you read that entire passage, the Kalamas are asking the Buddha how they can possibly know what to believe when so many contradicting views are being authoritatively taught to them. Teachers were coming from all around to the Kalamas and demanding that their beliefs be accepted as the best ones, the true ones, the only ones. And all of them were disparaging the beliefs of the others. It sounds a little bit like the comment section on your favorite social media site. It says, they expound and glorify their own doctrines, but as for the doctrines of others, they deprecate them, revile them, show contempt for them, and disparage them. They leave us absolutely uncertain and in doubt. And amid that confusion, the Buddha doesn't say, just believe what I told you and everything's going to be okay. He didn't demand mental assent to his favorite doctrines. He didn't threaten the community with exile or punishment, either here or in a future life. Instead, he affirmed their experience. Of course you are uncertain. Of course you are in doubt. When there are reasons for doubt, that's what happens. These are valuable insights, especially in this time of conspiracy theories, disinformation, and violence born of attachment to views. And it is that practice that we observed in the 14 Mindfulness Trainings. The history of Buddhism itself reveals the ongoing failure to take the Buddha's advice to the Kalamas. But it also provides us an opportunity and a set of practices for self-correction, which is profoundly important in creating and sustaining healthy communities in this process of demythologizing religion. When we attach to views, when we hitch our well-being to the inviolability of our own opinions and beliefs, we experience doubt and uncertainty as a threat to our very being, to our identity. And so we become defensive and we cannot risk uncertainty. But it's impossible. The world is constantly changing. We are constantly changing. Every conditioned phenomenon, everything is in process. Everything is a process. Our suffering is a process. Injustice and oppression are processes. Our attachment to views makes reflection on this and transformation of our stuck places difficult, if not impossible. And those are skills which are increasingly important as change today occurs at such a fast and unrelenting pace. In this ongoing practice of transforming our cultural and religious traditions, these kinds of practices offer an important approach to the process. And it has personally offered me an understanding of what keeping the faith can mean that helps and heals instead of harms. As the 14 Mindfulness Trainings taught us, we are committed to seeing the Buddhist teachings, or any cultural teaching, any religious teaching, as guiding means that help us learn to look deeply and develop understanding and compassion. They are not doctrines to fight, kill, or die for. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.